Welcome to Redesigning the Dharma. I'm your host, Adrian Baker, and today I'm speaking with Erik Davis. Erik is a scholar, an author, an award-winning journalist, a podcaster, and a popular speaker based in San Francisco. Erik grew up in California, spent 10 years on the East Coast, including studying literature and philosophy at Yale undergraduate, and then working in the freelance trenches of Brooklyn and Manhattan before moving back to San Francisco, where he currently resides. He's the author of 5 books, the most well-known of which is Technosis, Myth, Magic, and Mysticism in the Age of Information, a cult classic of visionary media studies that has been translated into 5 languages and most recently republished by North Atlantic Press. He has contributed chapters on art, music, technoculture, and contemporary spirituality to over a dozen books. And he's also a popular speaker, including at psychedelic conferences, which is how I originally met Erik. His forthcoming book is a book on LSD that will be coming out in April in time for Bicycle Day, the anniversary of Albert Hofmann's discovery of LSD, which looks to be a very interesting book. And he is also the host on the Expanding Mind podcast for over a decade. He got his PhD in religious studies from Rice University in 2015. More recently, he also has been writing a publication for Substack called Burning Shore. And without further ado, my conversation with Erik Davis. Well, Erik, thank you so much for speaking with me on Redesigning the Dharma, and it's really nice to connect again. So thank you for your time.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I still remember our conversation. How long ago was that? That was a little while ago.
It was. I think it was 2018. I will have read your bio, but if you want to say just a little something about what you're up to these days, your most recent work, especially with respect to Dharma or psychedelics or anything you're doing, would love to hear.
Yeah, well, I have a book coming out in a couple months that is a illustrated history and analysis of LSD blotter art, which was a very fun archival project. And other than that, I've been working on my Substack, which is called Burning Shore, and I've been writing there more and trying to kind of play with the form. And it's not really quite like what most people do in their Substacks, but it's fun. And we touch on these topics. Like I recently had a piece called You Are the Eyes of the World that looked at the Grateful Dead song Eyes of the World and translation of Longchenpa that uses that as a title. And I was kind of thinking about why that happened and what about these lyrics and how do we think about psychedelics and Dzogchen and, that kind of sort of playful explorations. And that's what I try to do is not write position papers. I'm not really like an opinion guy or a pundit in that sense, but I like to write essays in the classic old sense of the word of attempts of let's bring some themes together, try to write well and evocatively and richly around these complex, subtle, and sometimes funny and absurd topics, and have that be a sort of place. Because there's just so much opinion, and there's so much writing that is didactic or informational or positional, trying to build up a kind of argument for something. And there's just so much of that I prefer to bring like a looser and more evocative sense of writing to these really serious topics that I actually have a lot of opinions about, but I don't tend to write opinion forward. And then the other thing that I'm doing that's quite interesting to me, both as a personal practice and a sort of vocational opportunity, but also actually, frankly, as a kind of anthropological thing, which is that I'm involved in a on-the-ground, brick-and-mortar meditation / movement / culture and arts center in Berkeley called the Alembic. The Alembic is like a chemical vessel, or they use it in laboratories even today. It's like a vessel of transformation. And so I've been doing a lot of programming there and working on the place and trying to figure out what's its sensibility, how does it serve today, and getting a lot of younger people coming in who are interested in psychedelics, interested in meditation. A lot of them coming from a very different place than in my generation or my life. So I'm learning a lot about the contemporary Dharma and strengths and weaknesses about today's sort of younger crop of practitioners. So that's really been a very interesting and rich and rewarding part of my sort of work over the last couple of years, and will probably be, definitely a big part of what I'm doing for the next few years. I don't think I'm going to write another book for a little while, but I like writing for my Substack. So
Nice. I'm so curious, that last thing you said, what are you noticing about some of the, we can call it strengths or weaknesses, or even just what you're noticing about contemporary or younger generation of Dharma
Sure.
practitioners?
Well, it's definitely a Bay Area situation.
Right.
So what I'm going to say would be filtered through that. I suspect it would be different even in Los Angeles, let alone Milwaukee or Atlanta or whatever, because for a variety of reasons, we attract a particularly Bay Area set of people who work for technology companies who, let's say, we have OpenAI people who come to the Alembic. We definitely have people who are on the spectrum.
Okay.
And, I say that as a great lover of people on the spectrum and fascinating with that.
I'm on the spectrum. ADHD, no problem.
Reality. Yeah. And it's a, and it actually has a lot, in a way, that's the most concrete thing I could say in answer to your question, is because there's a lot of people who come who are not neurotypical in some ways. They actually have some real advantages in Dharma practice. So it's a really interesting thing. And I actually think that if you look at like the sort of mutation in contemporary Dharma over the last 5 to 10 years, let's say it's represented by Daniel Ingram, Hardcore Dharma, or TMI, that one feature of it, and I think this is very true of the Hardcore Dharma world, is that it actually introduces a kind of a sort of spectrum-y quality to certain aspects of practice with the discovery, the laser-pointed capacity to drill down and be, despite the scatteredness, be extremely focused and clear about what's happening, has actually helped super drive contemporary Dharma practice. Like, I get the sense from people coming, and I'm just generalizing now beyond the diagnostic category, which is so problematic, and some people it fits, some people it doesn't. It's, it's a mess to try to use that language, but I do it out of a fascination and a conviction that this is actually one of the major things about contemporary culture in the 21st century, is actually incorporating neurodiversity into the sort of range of things. So you have to kind of risk making generalizations and getting things a little wrong to point out something that's really happening. But my sense is that there actually is an acceleration of certain aspects of the awakening process in people, including people who are relatively young to the practice. And there's a different degree of not just enthusiasm, but a real conviction that the change can happen. Not just insights, but awakening is a real phenomenon. And we might actually get there, like next week or in a year. And that can go too far, and that's something else to talk about. But I think it's worth reflecting on just how exciting that is, how valuable that is, and how it's different. And here's the way that I would describe its difference from the past as a Gen Xer, someone who is on the upper end of Gen X. So I'm fairly close to the boomers, but I'm definitely not a boomer. So the boomers get to have their youthful naivete that enlightenment is just around the corner, or that they actually were enlightened last night on LSD, and now they're just kind of mopping up with their Zen or whatever. But there's a real sense in the late 1960s and the early 1970s that, man, we can do this. We're going to wake up. And there was a lot of awakenings, whether they were legitimate or not, doesn't really matter. But there's a lot of people who were like, oh my God, like I broke through and this is happening and this is not happening. And what am I going to do? What's the nature of the self? Who am I? Like this big explosion. And those people, doesn't quite pan out the way they thought over time. They have to deal with taxes and children and jobs and blah, blah, blah. And so as the Dharma matures from that explosion, when so many people were drawn to it because it had some resonance with psychedelics or with mysticism or the occult, and then as that matures, as the teachers are making money and they have a job and they have families, as the mainstream world goes, well, I guess something's okay about this Buddhism stuff. We can kind of bring that in. As all these things happen, it starts to mature, but it also becomes more ordinary. And you get the great Jack Kornfield book title. And I have total big props to Jack. He's a great teacher, and to his credit, he was kind of the first one, like leaving aside Ram Dass, he was kind of the first mainstream, well-established Dharma teacher who was vocally pro-psychedelic when he didn't have to be. He could have just kept his mouth shut and been like, yeah, we did all that back in those days. It was good, but we're not going to talk about it now. And that's how the way that a lot of Dharma teachers from that generation, the boomer Dharma teachers were. And he didn't do that. So he gets extra cred in my book, but he's got that great title, like After the Ecstasy, the Laundry. So from a Gen X perspective, for people coming up in the 80s into the 90s, the Dharma scene has this kind of compromised vibe. There's all these scandals, people are getting older, they didn't wake up the way they thought. So, maybe it's really kind of a little bit more ordinary. It's ordinary mind, it's ordinary life, it's doing the laundry, which is also part of the Dharma. It's also part of truth. I totally recognize that. But to get stuck there, especially for young people, is lame. Young people should go for the gold. They should go out there and like snarl and, and hopefully their teachers and their traditions can sort of temper that or refine it or point it in the right direction. But to come up with a kind of after the ecstasy, the laundry attitude, it's a little weak sauce. So now that's not the case anymore. People are like, no, I can read this book and I can do this practice and then smoke a little 5-MeO and I might actually make it. I don't think that's necessarily true personally. Like I'm a little bit more of a ordinary mind guy, but I think that energy is great. And that it's more, again, about like refining, targeting, pointing out the blind spots, but using that energy, which partly has to do with a certain confidence, a certain quality of secularism, a certain kind of transparency about what we're doing, like a step away, even farther from the guru model or from the mysterious model of the unspoken ineffable, towards more explicitness, more practice, more method, more down-to-earthness, and a more peer-to-peer kind of sensibility around things. All of those have their shadow sides, but it's definitely a different energy, and psychedelics play an important role in that, but it's different than the way they played a role in the 60s and 70s. Quite different in some ways, I think. So it's a very interesting time, and working at the Alembic, interfacing with younger people who are serious practitioners and having awakening experiences and getting lost in interesting ways, it's been quite an eye-opener for me.
I mean, there's so much. First of all, I'd love to come back to this with the Alembic, because it sounds like one thing that it's very much doing is an open source approach to Dharma and Tantra, which is really what I'm interested in. One thing I want to invite you to elaborate on is just sort of something that you said about the way your perception or your view tends to be a little more old school with respect to psychedelics and awakening. And in researching to prepare for this podcast, I sense that actually our views are quite similar in this respect. There was one quote that you said, might have been speaking with Michael Taft, and you basically said, with psychedelics, disenchantment is as important as enchantment. And for me, when you said that, I have a sense that that spirit is the view that you're conveying. That's certainly a bit part of my message, but I'm curious if you could elaborate on that, and if you could say a little more about that quote of why psychedelics, or maybe even waking up, is as much about disenchantment as enchantment.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I remember when I said that the first time, I was like, oh yeah, that's something. Like, I'm not even sure. It's like one of those things, sometimes I'll say stuff and I'm not even sure if I know all the ways that it's true.
Right.
And so it kind of stays with me as a kind of koan or like probe to like, okay, what was that? Because that landed, but what did you actually mean? And I meant different things about it. One, in a way, slightly more superficial thing is that I was writing an early, piece I wrote called The Paisley Gate, was about the connection between psychedelics and the Dharma through the lens of Tantra. And while I didn't know very much about Tantra then, I only know a little bit more now, including how little I know, but I have a better sense of the territory. And there I was really kind of just pulling out a few things that I still think I got basically right, which had to do with how, because they were illegal mean, they still are basically illegal, but they were like illegal and forbidden, that psychedelics had a kind of extra tantric charge just because of the social fact of their being forbidden.
It's
You're going to go into
transgressive.
traditional,
Yeah.
it's transgressive against an actual social agreement about what's right and what's wrong. It can't just be transgressive because you're like, oh yeah, I'm doing it in my own way. It's got to actually be transgressive the way that like eating a cow in 9th century India is like really transgressive, but it's not that transgressive in, like, in Milwaukee. It's like, what? You're having a hamburger? What's the problem? So there is a kind of social factor, and that it was true about psychedelics. So you were a criminal by using them. Your Dharma communities probably didn't want to hear about it, and maybe they were actively opposed to it. So those people who were Buddhist practitioners, but who kept their faith with psychedelics, also had a kind of shadowy role in a lot of Dharma communities. And so I was talking about these relationships, and that's, by the way, largely gone. Even though the drugs themselves are illegal, the whole cultural story around them is utterly transformed. And while that's groovy and hopefully fewer people go to prison, because that sucks, it's just the fact that there is no longer a charge. In fact, not only is there no longer a charge, there's actually like a kind of other charge that has to be dealt with. But that's another topic. Let me just go back to this question about disenchantment. So one thing I was writing was that, like, if you compare the path of psychedelics and the path of Dharma, let's say, and by the way, I want to make this real clear, I don't think they're the same thing. I follow Patrick Lundberg here, who wrote a wonderful book. He was an independent researcher, writer, a scholar of psychedelic music. Like, he was a big music collector, record collector, and he died, unfortunately. He was Swedish, or maybe Danish. I don't know. Anyway, sorry. He wrote this great book. And at the end, he talks about how many people have used religion or mysticism or the occult to map or model psychedelics. And he's like, yeah, that makes sense. Totally, especially Eastern mysticism, totally makes sense, but it's wrong. And he's saying wrong, not that it's not useful, but that it's really, really important for him, and I kind of believe this, to just let psychedelics be their own thing. They're their own path. There are multiple paths, but it's not the same thing as practice. And by making that distinction, I think we actually help both things along more than trying to say they're actually kind of the same thing or they're pointing to the same thing. And it's like, well, maybe they're ultimately pointing to the same thing, but in some fundamental ways, they're different practices. And just the way that I can be a Zen practitioner and a musician, and I bring some of my Zen into my music and, some of my improvisation into my Zen, but they're not the same thing. That would be dumb. That, I believe, is a kind of healthy model for psychedelics in its relationship to the Dharma. But there's some advantages to psychedelics over the Dharma. And one of them is that if you're a Dharma practitioner and it's the 4th day of your sesshin and you have a profound mystical experience and you see a spinning wheel of Buddhas and light pouring down and it illumines your heart and the whole hall is radiant, you're going to be pretty fucking attached to that thing. You're going to inflation, attachment, I'm special, something's happened, et cetera, et cetera. Now, that kind of stuff can obviously happen with psychedelics. People have breakthroughs and then they think they're Jesus or they think they're an enlightened being. That does happen all the time. So in a way, it's not really a perfect analogy. But for me and my milieu and the kind of people that I knew and the kind of people that I respected and the kind of people that I read were more sophisticated. And they knew that whatever marvels happen, you are on a metabolic journey. And as your body metabolizes these materials, the phenomenology is going to change. You get a window and then the window closes. So the next day you're like, wow, that was pretty intense, that encounter with the cosmic all mind. And here I am, I'm looking out the window. I got to get some cash together to go get some coffee. It contains within it a kind of downbeat or realism as part of the envelope of the phenomenology. And so In that way, it actually has a leg up over the kinds of mystical experiences that happen to people when they're just focused like on the natch, because then anything that happens has got to be real. Like, oh my God, like I
Right.
really deserve that vision of the spoked wheel with the Buddhas and the light. I mean, that was like me, man. That was like I was on the natch. So it's like, yeah, maybe, but I don't know that. But it could also just be like, well, that was a good day, or you got a boon, or the cosmic cards fell out right. So in a way, there's a kind of realism about visionary experience within, let's call it sophisticated psychedelic use, that I think it actually gives you an advantage. So part of it is that the highs you want, the ecstasies you want, because we all want them. We all love it when they're happening. Oh my God, finally, this is great. That those things are part of the path. They clearly have a role to play, but they're not the whole story. And in fact, for me, psychedelics are kind of more interesting the farther away you are from the experience. The psychedelic experience. And it's like, yeah, but what's more interesting is kind of what happens. Like, as I often say to people, I'm less interested in psychedelic drugs or psychedelic experiences than I am in psychedelic people. Like, what
Yes.
happens? You keep doing this to yourself, you're going to change whether you want to or not. And some people don't change that much. But even then, there's this sort of openness, there's this sort of quality that shifts. And then other people, they really change a great deal. I mean, the way that Dharma practice can make someone change, can lighten your load, can open your view, can let you hold things more lightly or engage on multiple levels. So that's sort of one kind of obvious dimension. But then there's some more subtle phenomenological ones, which is that, and this is again, I'm just talking from my own experience, is that part of my tutelage with psychedelics, and by the way, I think that's actually in a way the most important model, is that whatever psychedelics are, whatever their value for you, however much you see them religiously or in a secular context, it's a teaching relationship. You are learning how you respond to these opportunities. And it loops. You learn things, and then that shifts the next situation, and you can kind of build on it over time. And that learning may be very cosmic and very metaphysical and involve gods and dimensions. And that learning can be very physical, can be very psychological, and it's usually some mixture of both. But in both contexts, for me, there's very important lessons about, in a way, deconstructing and disenchanting the visionary. It's not the whole story. And in fact, it's a little delusional sometimes. And what's more interesting to me is this kind of the interstices of these experiences, their gaps, the ways in which they relate to your own experiences, your own set and setting, your own programming, your own metaphysics. So we know that set and setting have a huge role to play in people's experiences. What does that mean? That means that it's not just about taking 4 grams of psilocybin mushrooms in a room. It's like, well, what is my attitude about that going into the experience? And where am I? And where am I is not just the room with its lighting and it has music and this kind of music and not that kind of music, all that programming stuff. It's also the larger cultural story. What are mushrooms? What are they good for? What do people use them for? What can they afford? What can they not afford? So there's all this context that we bring into the encounter, and that context has a real impact on the phenomenology of the experience. Well, that means that I should not be taking my phenomenology at face value. That means that my own experience, in a way, is material to be reworked, even to some degree analyzed or integrated, if you will, based on my own expectations, my own stories, my own hopes and dreams. It's a little bit more like dream interpretation. And in doing so, disenchantment is a really powerful tool to clarify, to identify, to discriminate the various features that are going on, rather than just sort of reveling in the emotions of wonder and awe and joy and fear and these sort of memories of these extraordinary images or beings that you felt you had a contact with or insights or, all that stuff's great. But if you don't also start breaking it down, that teaching loop that I was describing only goes so far. And you're more likely to become inflated. You're more likely to become delusional. You're probably more likely to get stuck in a kind of like, I got to go back to that place where I experience awe and wonder again. And so again, to my mind, there's something about disenchantment, not in the sense of like, oh, life is meaningless, although the meaningless void is to me a very important place, both in Dharma and in psychedelics, but more the sense of a kind of not just irony, but a certain way, a kind of humor and a kind of like awareness of the constructedness of our experience. And you can't really get to that insight about the constructedness unless you are willing to disenchant the sort of surface story of what is happening.
I think especially what you're saying towards the end there. What jumps out to me is so many people come to think of psychedelics or awakening, to your point about meditation, though it's more obvious for psychedelics, is about chasing peak experiences. And of course, that's what we can do in life. And then that gets projected onto the spiritual journey. And so I think one can relate to it that way. But what I find from working with psychedelics, it's really more and more to appreciate how it's changing my perception in ordinary life when I'm not on it, just like meditation. And for me, a lot of awakening is about appreciation of beauty and aesthetics and art and savoring experience. And I think that if we relate to it in that way, psychedelics can be a real enhancement. But the critical aspect, and it's interesting, I really would have resonated, I think, and I still do in some ways, with what you're saying about separating psychedelics and Dharma. And I've come to have a bit of a different view, but it's only quite specific to ayahuasca and ayahuasca analog soma. But this is just my meaning making as well. And it just so happens with those plants, the plants themselves seem to mirror quite perfectly Dharmakaya, Sambhogakaya, in that union of appearances. So I think there's something that lends itself to that. But, it's the same thing with meditation. Meditation without the view is like one leg without the other, they say in Dzogchen and Mahamudra. And I find that is absolutely critical when working with plant medicine or psychedelics, whether we're talking about how to shift from chasing peak experiences to really savoring the nature of mind that's always and already here and really magnificent in this beautiful display in its own right. And I'm really curious, perhaps related to this topic, as a Zen practitioner, how do you relate to plant medicine, and if you can even say specifically ayahuasca, in a non-dual way? And in what ways is that aligned or not aligned sometimes with the way it's offered? Because it's offered in a different context, which has a different view. And I'm curious how you make sense of that, integrate that with your sort of non-dual Zen practice.
I have a lot of respect for people who have done a long, deep apprenticeship, particularly with ayahuasca, and I do not put myself in that category. I mean, I have had a decent exposure. I've had quite a range of experiences, but I don't have that kind of depth that some people do, which itself is kind of interesting, the way in which it sort of becomes kind of a special category. Like it's sort of like there's psychedelics and then there's ayahuasca. And why that is and what it has to do with the phenomenology and with the culture. And there's a lot of interesting things to say about it, but I understand the distinction. And I would say that one of the reasons that I've always been attracted to Zen, and Zen is such an important part of my practice, although more and more forms of Dzogchen and Mahamudra are really key, as well as non-dual Shaivite Tantra. But all of the sort of, non-dual awareness orientations. But the one I liked about Zen is that they just don't go into a lot of stuff. So you can just kind of like, you can just plug it in. It has a certain sensibility about minimalism and a certain kind of lack of Rococo elaboration. But, then you can just do that anywhere. That's why there's all that cliche of like, whatever, the Zen of motorcycle maintenance or sailing or, programming computers or whatever. It's like a sensibility you can bring to anything, including sitting in a group of global northerners who are in some ways tapping into a mestizo tradition from the Amazon and bringing forward some mixture of actual apprenticeship with songs, with remixes and subtle and not so subtle shifts in the overall idea of what we're doing with this medicine, as opposed to its mestizo or indigenous context. So, my anthropologist is fine with this situation. Like, I'm fine recognizing that I'm in this kind of curious mixture zone, and that the drive that I bring with it is just a kind of devotion to like clarity and honesty. And a friend of mine said something very interesting that I've been sitting with about ayahuasca recently, where she said, because we were talking about different allies and different dimensions of those worlds, and she goes, one thing about ayahuasca is it really keeps you honest. And that I really appreciated. I was like, okay, I think I know what you're pointing out there. And so then along those lines, there's a kind of, I think, support for the groundedness and clarity of simple awareness that is not framed in the same way in other situations. That said, you're in a situation often within the West where there's a kind of quasi-religious character and people have certain assumptions and they personify in certain ways. And so, it's that interesting blend. But for me, it's like I've always been very comfortable being, let's call it a seeker who is also a participant observer, or who's also an anthropologist. In fact, to me, I think that's actually one of the great skills to develop as a seeker, because then rather than going into a situation with like the seeker's question, is this true? Is it not true? Is this going to help illuminate my path? Is this not going to help illuminate? I don't know. But you go in there as an anthropologist, as a participant observer, and you're going, well, I'm just going to check this out, see where it goes, see what happens.
It invites discernment.
Yeah, it invites discernment, but also it doesn't, you can, from that perspective, and if we're really being non-dual about it, you can have profound insights at a NASCAR race, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? Why couldn't you? I mean, it might be unexpected, might be unusual, probably more likely to happen at the Zen session, but and I say that with an extreme example, because then when you go into any kind of religious context where people are seeking, where people are trying to get down to like ultimate truths or, the highest values or insight or awareness, whatever you want to call it, even if it's also kind of messy in other ways or problematic, you can sort of take what's good there. You can like participate in what you want to participate and observe what you want to observe. So being a participant observer allows you to lean in to the degree that you're comfortable or that it resonates. And when it doesn't, it's fine. Whereas if you're a seeker, you're like, oh, this isn't working for me. Who's that shaman? Is he really a shaman? It's just some white guy, grew up in LA. What? But if you're a participant observer, you're like, wow, this is really resonating for me. That's powerful stuff. And like, yeah, isn't it funny? Like, I don't even really know where this guy's coming from. Like, what does that mean? But so it creates a kind of comfort with ambiguity, as well as a commitment to discernment and a kind of generosity. Because you're like, well, let's just see what's going on here. Like, I don't need it to be pure. I don't need it to be perfect. I don't need it to be authentic even, because I've had profound experiences in inauthentic places, under inauthentic conditions. So that, and I'm not saying that has really anything to do with Zen necessarily. It's just that that's the way that I have come to be in these situations. And so while there's usually some degree of alienation in having this kind of approach, and it can be lonely in some ways and, some contexts, in general, I feel pretty good with that. And indeed, the more you're sort of then bringing what's really at heart for you to the medicine, like, I'm going to like, this is awake awareness now, man. I'm not screwing around. Like, great gods, great Icaros, songs, the phenomenology of the group. Sure, wonderful, but I'm serious. This is what my work is right now. And you can't always get there. But when you do, then it's like you're doing your thing in this other context. If it doesn't work out, then that's not clearly going to be a very fruitful path for you. But if it does, it almost doesn't matter what other people are constructing there, whether it's a spirit, whether it's, this kind of message, whether it's demanding this kind of work or not. So, yeah. And in that sense, I think that ayahuasca in particular is very supportive of a kind of direct presence. And that for me, a lot of the work in it, and it is a lot of work more than I think other things in some fundamental ways, that for me, the work is often about the visible, almost almost carnal distinction between presence, awake, aware, present to the now, and then all the bullshit that I wrap myself in to hide from it all the time, which in a way is just the normal condition.
Absolutely. And the medicine just amplifies that.
It
So you can
just
see it more
amplifies it.
vividly.
And it's just like, oh shit, this is just this. In fact, like in the midst of some grueling, you know, 3 hour three of like, oh God, this is fucking grueling. It was like, I realized that part of what made it grueling is that for all the bells and whistles, all the wild phenomenology, it was totally familiar because it was really just the same basic challenge, which is this every day, you know, the nighttime, the insomnia, whatever, like presence. Oh, here's the story. I'm attaching. I'm like, I got a loop. Oh, the narcissism and wait. There's something going on here. Oh, you know, to a point of like kind of almost absurdity because it's amplified so much. But in that very amplification, it's also extremely clarifying. And when those spaces of presence were enabled to sort of percolate and develop in their own way without struggle or strain, there was a particular excellence to the sense of, to the sense of the deep mind, of the similarity, let's say, the resonance between the environment and the internal state. And so, you know, quite remarkable in that sense as well, but also a little bit ordinary, you know. I mean, my practice is always like, you know, sometimes you can't be in the room, but like I'm in the room. Like, yeah, there's other stuff's happening, but I'm in the room. I'm in this room, in this place. There's some bodies. There's this guy over there. There's this woman over here. There's the thing over, you know, like, and a lot of people I think are just, they're ready to go. They just want to go.
Like
They
up and
want to
out.
like, yeah, up and out or whatever, which is great. It's fine, but it's just my way, partly because of participant observation, partly because of being kind of a natural anthropologist, is that I'm also like aware of the room. But the good side of that from a practice point of view is that I'm always ready. I'm always up for ordinary mind. It's not disappointing. I'm perfectly happy to be like aware of like, okay, they're running, they got their little flashlight over there because they got to decide who's going to sing the next song. And there's a little bit of tension about who's going to sing, you know, and the person next to me is in like some faraway castle. I mean, I like the castles too. If the castles show up, I'll go hang out. But like, I'm also very resonant with like what's actually happening in the room. And it's the same thing that I've had with a lot of meditation spaces or even ceremonial magic. I was just telling a story today where I was in a ceremonial magic Western occult order for a number of years. And I got a lot out of it. I really liked the people. It was really fun. But there was a moment when I kind of realized that I'm not really a magician. And that was like, we had set up the hall and, you know, we're all in robes and we've just invoked the gods. And, you know, it's this whole kind of elaborate theater of gods. And we were just going to have like a sort of meditation in the middle of it. And, you know, a lot of people were like flying with their associations. And later on, they were telling these stories about the spirits they saw or the patterns they saw or the messages they got about this and that symbol or whatever. And so I was sitting there in the middle and I was like, okay, I'm going to, here we go. And I'm like meditating and I'm like, I'm in a room, the carpet's stained, the fluorescent lights are buzzing. I have nowhere to go and I'm totally content. That's what was happening.
Just this.
And so I'm like, yeah, like I could keep doing this, but in a way, like that's like kind of just the way I lean. And I think there's an element of that happens in these extraordinary circumstances that is, you know, sometimes a little disappointing because it is fun to go to the astral palaces and meet the gods and swim with mermaids and all that kind of stuff. And those things do happen sometimes, but there's something that's more like a kind of ordinary mind, which is right next door to non-dual, to Rigpa. And that's, I guess, a part of what I really love about Zen is like, you know, that the way really is ordinary mind. And it doesn't mean just like the ordinary mind, like, oh, I got to do this today. And, you know, I hate Bluetooth because it causes static or whatever. It's something else, but it's right there. and that right there-ness points to something that is, yeah, it's got a salty feel to it. It's got a this here-ness quality to it. It takes it even more out of the mystical reification that our minds constantly project in order to make something special and make it exotic, make it, outside the norm. So yeah, so that's, I think, the way in which the Zen stays with me as I move through spaces that are extraordinary and ordinary kind of at the same time.
Yeah. I mean, I think equanimity is certainly emphasized in all Buddhist traditions, but just thinking about it from the Dzogchen or Mahamudra, I mean, all four measurables sort of are qualities of resting in Rigpa, but equanimity is absolutely foundational. So it's intrinsic to that recognition. A minute ago, you were talking about, this desire to get back to authentic. I think you were saying it in a plant medicine context, and it just brings up how long there's this very strong impulse within the human psyche to get back to what's pure, original, authentic. And it brings me back to what you're doing with the Alembic and this sort of open source approach to Dharma, meditation, Tantra, because I think there's such a healthy conversation discussion there. We hear a lot of voices within, I guess, that have always been there in traditions resisting innovation or change because there's fear of losing the pure, original, true teachings. But where was the point when there was the original, pure Buddhism or whatever it is?
Yeah, that's a
between
great issue.
tradition,
and
innovation.
I don't have an easy answer for it because in that sense, I have a great deal of respect for traditionalists and conservatives. In the sense that I really get what their worries are about. And I think
Yeah.
a lot of it is actually true. It's just that for me, both with my upbringing in the era that I was in California, in the sort of after wave of the spiritual counterculture and all of the mixture and all of the cults and all of the, flim-flam men and women and the whole thing, it's like I can't pretend to get back to that place, but I appreciate deeply the critique, and I see it as like an unresolvable conundrum. The problem of the more accessible you make it, the more you make it workable for contemporary people, the more you lose, I wouldn't even say necessarily authenticity, I would almost say character. Becomes more efficient, becomes more clear, becomes more transparent. It's more, what's the word, kind of explicable, right? So the way that I approach it personally is recognizing the way that the modern condition can erode the juice, the spark, the authentic, pure thing, if you want to call it that way, but really more just like the power of transmission and the power of encounter. That modern conditions, a desire for explicitness, a desire for clarity, for method, for a lack of mystagoguery, all those kind of impulses, which make a lot of sense. It's partly what the modern world's about. They also lose things and lose some very significant things. And one way I think that I've come to be around to deal with that is to insist on the mystery, insist on not knowing. It's almost like you go so far in the direction of like, look, nobody knows what's going on. We're all making it up as we go along. All the traditions are invented. It's all bullshit. We're all just doing our best. Like almost you take that so far so you don't know anymore. So yeah, you can use this method, but come on, just a method. What? You think it's really going to do that for you? But that's my kind of personal way to sort of handle this problem, because once you've acknowledged the mystery and the limits of your own hubris, the limits of your own knowledge, the limits of your own conviction about some particular method or some particular teacher, that then the mystery returns and you're once again, there's a synchronicity. Once again, there's not knowing. Once again, there's intuition. Once again, there's all of these things that sort of pull you outside of your ego's sort of knowledge and desire to control. So that's sort of what I see, because one of the problems I see with the modern open source method is just that it just empowers the individual to be more in control and to be more knowledgeable about what's happening. So there's a great fetishization of particular methods. There's a resistance to anything that's kind of supernatural or that involves gods or involves dreams or involves all this sort of like fuzzy analog stuff that was once much more dominant in the kind of occult, mystical 60s and 70s. Now that stuff it's there, but it's not there. It's like there is an occult resurgence, but in other ways, it's kind of, a lot of things have this sort of digital gloss that involve a certain kind of explicitness.
Yeah, and one thing that strikes me is that the open source approach need not go in that direction of totally demystifying everything. But I can see the tendency, and I can also see, given what you shared earlier about the tech crowd at the Alembic, how in particular, perhaps the demographic in this area, other things about their background, their training might really bias towards that.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, I think, well, there's still, it's not necessary, but let's just stay with it because it's an interesting problem that it's about this idea of explicitness. So one way of describing what the Enlightenment is, in the Western sense of science and reason, is a basic commitment to explicitness, that anything that's worth saying is worth saying explicitly and clearly. So if we're going to talk about science, we don't need to use poetic metaphors. That's not going to help. We want to say as much as we can what we see. That's the gambit. And, there's a lot to be said for that on a lot of dimensions. And most of us are, to some degree, creatures of that move. So that then gets interesting when you come to spiritual paths, because then, what's being explicit? Well, the methods themselves and a sort of resistance to traditional modes of poeticizing, of acknowledging mystery, of acknowledging the unknown, of non-rational features, that gods are real and they can interface with us through our dreams or, all that kind of stuff. You're like, yeah, maybe, but that's not really true to the spirit of explicitness. Whereas if I take, Theravada Buddhism and kind of break it down and create a kind of method of that, that's super explicit. And so it works really well in the modern context. So the whole story of Buddhist modernity is the way in which these currents that were full of magic and mystery and obscurantism and supernaturalism and all this kind of stuff, all of them, including Theravadan, that they became recoded as explicit and visible and to some degree rational. Yeah. And so we're kind of in this weird zone where we're like, that's not sufficient, but we also don't really want to like go back to gurus and authoritarian masters who know everything and tell you the way things are going to be. That's not really going to work either. So we're in this really funny, weird place that I kind of like in a way. And the fun thing about when you say open source, it also makes me realize that the magical order that I talked about earlier was named the Open Source Order of the Golden Dawn. And what they had done is they had gone back into the Golden Dawn traditions, which is in a way kind of the most significant single ceremonial magic order in at least the English-speaking world of the last 150 years. But those ceremonies were actually kind of published, even though there's a lot of secrecy. They're kind of published, and they went in. They actually changed them. They said, "Oh, we don't like all the Christian stuff. We're going to put like more pagan stuff back in there and throw in some Aleister Crowley and whatever." So they were actively piecing together the tradition, and they call it open source because it's all available. You can read the ceremonies; they're online. They're in this different kind of moment where secrecy. It's not that there's no secrets, and it's not that the secrets that are necessary for the power of rituals to be effective are overwritten, but the secrets are kind of like they're embedded in a larger commitment to explicitness that has a peer-to-peer kind of quality to it. Like we're all in this boat together. We're all bozos on this bus. And to me, that's the part of it that I really relate with. Like you say, it doesn't need to be just tool-based, which it does tend to be. It's like open source means here's the tools and you can use the tools however you want. And that doesn't, in a spiritual context, that doesn't undermine the tool user, which is the ego, which is the one who always wants to be in control, the one who knows, the one who can make things happen according to what they want to do, even if that's enlightenment. And you need that guy around, but he's got to be in his place too. So the other kind of open source is really more this sort of sense of peer-to-peer spirituality, where I may know something you don't, you may know something that I don't. I'm hanging out and you give me a teaching or I give you a teaching. So, in that sense, I have the authority or you have the authority. I'm the student, you're the teacher. But the larger context within which we are playing out these relationships is a peer-to-peer situation. And we can describe that as being, we're all going to die. Nobody knows what's going to happen when you die. If you say you do know what's going to happen when you die, you're full of shit. You don't. Sorry. Yeah, maybe,
Totally.
whatever. But like, there's a fundamental like similarity in our condition, our existential condition. And we're all bozos on this bus. And yeah, I know something about posture and Zen, and you know something about Dzogchen teachings and Bluetooth headphones, and I know something about septic systems, and whatever. We know things, we can teach things. But the larger open source is also this kind of spirit of peer-to-peer. And that is something that we're trying to bring into Alembic. But it's, of course, it's not easy, because if you have young people who are so full of themselves that they know what everything is, but you don't have a system of tradition where that's being knocked out of them, like in a traditional monastery where you go there and you just like, if you were like full of your own piss and vinegar, you're going to get knocked down. And, you got to pull up your piece, you got to figure it out, like based on not being the one. So it's tough. We're in a very strange kind of transition. And for me, one of the keys is, one, to always acknowledge mystery and the limits of our knowledge. And for the people who have authority, to give that authority away, not like dispense it, like not carry it at all, but to constantly remind people in the situation that there's a limit on what the authority is, or it's an authority in a certain context within a larger context that is not authoritarian.
Hierarchies are flexible, is what I'm hearing, and contextual.
Contextual, democratic, if you will. And so that's an interesting game. And the other way into that spirit, along with not knowing, it's related, but it's a little different, is pluralism. And, what that word means, it means different things to different people. It's seen nowadays as kind of a liberal strategy for society that's no longer sufficient given the crises that we face. Like that was the old, way of thinking, oh, we have a pluralistic society, particularly in the United States, likes to think it has a pluralistic society. But I still think there's just a lot to be said for having a genuine, deep, ontological pluralism. And so I'm deeply pluralist. Like, I don't know what it means to say there's like one thing, that it's all one. It's all one mind. I'm like, I don't know. The traditions, even the non-dual traditions that I'm most attracted to, like Kashmiri Shaivism or Zen, yeah, they're non-dual, but they also have bring a lot of attention to multiplicity, the ordinariness of matter, relations to inanimate objects, birds, shit. It's like, that's the kind of non-dual I'm interested in, because it makes so much room for the multiple, which is also making room for the plural. I was just reading Christopher Wallace's great translation of what he calls the Recognition Sutras, and he makes a really interesting point about this really wonderful book, written 10th, 11th century, is that there's a certain part where the author goes through and lays out all the other traditions and what they say. And this is a classic thing. You see it in Buddhist texts all the time. It's like, oh, here's the Pratya-Buddhas and da-da-da-da, and how they always get it wrong, except for us.
Right.
But in this text,
setting up the rebuttal.
He doesn't do that. He's like, yeah, these guys actually kind of get it right. They might actually be able to go all the way with this. It's not what I say. I have this other stuff I want to tell you, but it's like genuinely pluralistic. And you're like, man, my God, it's 11th century. You got to be like genius level to be able to tolerate that degree of diversity at that period of time. So in a much more modest way, for me, part of that is to, like, when you're having a meditation center, you have different meditations, you have different body practices.
Right.
And we're, in this sense, very inspired by aspects of the old school Esalen from the 60s, 70s, 80s, where one of the great lines, if you know anything about Esalen in those years, was Michael Murphy's line that nobody captures the flag. And what that meant was that there was a lot of dissension and conflict in Esalen between the people, the Gestalt people over here and the Tai Chi people over here and the psychedelic people over here and whatever. I mean, that's not quite right, but like you get the idea is that there's not a single kind of way. And so at the Alembic, even though we have, a resident teacher, we have our own biases towards Tantra, towards essence traditions. Nonetheless, we're really committed to like having that pluralism, because then when you come into it, you're like, even if you really want to believe your view of the thing is right, in order to socialize, in order to be part of that community, you have to acknowledge that there are these multiple views. And while in some ways that's sort of like not that profound, in a way, in our world today with polarization and with people's seemingly inexhaustible ability to believe they know what's true, it's actually still kind of almost radical. So that's another way that we try to create an environment that makes room for mystery, makes room for not knowing, and the things that can only come with not knowing in that kind of profound way.
I love that. I think that's a great note on which to conclude. And Erik, I want to thank you for your time and give you the chance to let people know where they can find you about any upcoming offerings that you have.
Sure. Thanks for the opportunity, Adrian. It's a great conversation. I have a Substack. It's called Burning Shore. And it's a couple times a month, and I put out long essays about cool shit. And I always put all my announcements in my classes right now. Like I'm teaching a class on Philip K. Dick at the Alembic, and it's partly streamable and partly in person. The Berkeley Alembic is the name of the place. That's our website, berkeleyAlembic.org. And we have, lots of classes. And again, a lot of them are available for streaming. And there's a lot of really nice stuff coming up. So that's the main stuff that I'm happening right now. And then in April, my next book called Blotter, The Untold Story of an Acid Medium, which is a history and analysis of LSD blotter art from the street origins to today's collectible, will be out from MIT Press, and that should be fun. I look forward to that one.
Great. Looking forward to that. That's exactly the kind of niche topic I love.
Super niche.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thanks so much, Erik. Appreciate your time.
Well, thank you very much.
All right. Take care. We'll be in touch.